Just in one night, this man lost everything: his family, his home, his peaceful life. But that very moment of tragedy transformed him into a legendary warrior, feared by both Mexico and the United States. Yet, in the final moments of his life, why did this man leave the world with regret? Why did he regret? February 1909, Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The cold crept through the cracks of an old, worn-out cabin. Geronimo laid there, his breath ragged, his body weakened by pneumonia. For 36 years, Geronimo fought relentlessly against both Mexico and the United States to defend Apache land. But in 1886, he was forced to surrender. From that moment on, the life of a free warrior was over. He became a prisoner, stripped of his freedom, exiled from his homeland. Throughout his life, Geronimo witnessed his people massacred, enslaved, and their lands stolen. This tragedy forged him into a nightmare on the battlefield, a ruthless warrior with no mercy. He never regretted fighting against the U.S. But if given the chance, Geronimo would have continued his war against Mexico, the enemy he blamed most for the suffering of the Apache people. And Mexico felt the same. They never forgot the hatred and devastation that Geronimo and his Apache warriors had inflicted upon them. Today, we explore the brutal blood feud between Mexico and the Apache, fueled by betrayal and revenge. Throughout the 1830s, tensions between Mexico and the Apache remained in a constant state of unrest. While the Mexican government attempted to negotiate peace, the Apache saw these treaties as temporary truces with individual towns, rather than binding agreements with an entire nation. To them, signing a treaty with one settlement did not mean they owed loyalty to the Mexican government. As a result, peace was always short-lived, and violence erupted time and time again. By 1833, the conflict escalated. The Mexican government struggled to contain the Apache, mobilizing its military and imposing heavy taxes to fund more soldiers. Despite their efforts, Apache warriors used their deep knowledge of the land to strike quickly and disappear before Mexican forces could respond. Desperate to eliminate the Apache threat, the Mexican government implemented brutal policies designed to wipe out entire communities. Authorities placed bounties on Apache scalps, offering payments for every man, woman, or child killed. These bounties, sometimes worth hundreds of pesos, a small fortune at the time, attracted hardened bounty hunters who set out on ruthless manhunts. With sharp blades and fast horses, they targeted not only warriors, but also defenseless Apache women and children. The violence did not end with death. Those who were captured faced an even darker fate. Apache captives, especially women and children, were bound in chains and dragged across the desert under the scorching sun, only to be sold into slavery on distant farms. Young Apache children, torn from their families, were raised in a world where their identity was erased, forced to adopt foreign customs, and work as servants for the very people who had slaughtered their parents. For the Apache, this was not just war, it was the destruction of their way of life. By 1839, Mexico intensified its efforts. A 200-man force under James Kaiser attacked even peaceful Apache groups, reinforcing the belief that Mexicans could not be trusted. The conflict was fueled by cultural misunderstandings. Apache leaders did not recognize Mexican institutions, and the Mexicans failed to grasp Apache traditions. To the Apache, being forced into reservations, an idea later introduced by the United States, was no different from slavery. One striking example of this cultural divide came when the governor of Chihuahua attempted to negotiate with Woa, a well-known Apache leader. The governor asked the Apache to only raid male cattle to preserve the breeding population. Woa listened patiently. However, when the governor demanded they stop scalping Mexicans, Woa responded sharply, pointing out that Scalping had not originated with the Apache, but with the Mexicans, who had first placed bounties on Apache heads. He even highlighted a bitter irony. By the 1850s, the Mexican government had quietly abandoned scalp bounties after realizing they had been tricked into paying for the heads of their own citizens. The war between Mexico and the Apache was not just about land or survival. It was a clash of two vastly different worlds. The Apache, with their nomadic lifestyle, saw borders as meaningless, while the Mexicans sought to establish firm territorial control. Each side viewed the other as the ultimate aggressor, deepening the cycle of violence and vengeance. By the 1840s, the war had left deep scars on both sides. Reports from Chihuahua and Sonora estimated that around 6,000 Mexicans had been killed, while Apache casualties numbered roughly 100. Though these figures remain uncertain, they reveal the devastating toll of a conflict fueled by hatred, vengeance, and a fundamental inability to understand each other. Neither side could break the cycle of violence, and so the war raged on, shaping the destiny of the Apache and Mexico for years to come. In 1859, Geronimo launched an attack on Sonora, once the stronghold of Mexico. Leading a group of Apache warriors, he stormed into the town, killing every man in sight and taking women and children captive before retreating to their stronghold. But this was only the beginning. Once news of the massacre spread, the Mexican army immediately mobilized a pursuit, scouring the mountains for the attackers. As Geronimo observed the soldiers hunting them, he recognized some of them. These were the same men who had slaughtered his family the year before. His hatred burned even hotter. This time, Geronimo refused to run. Rather than relying on the Apache's usual hit-and-run tactics, he led his warriors in a direct confrontation against the Mexican troops, a bold and unusual strategy. The battle raged for nearly 2 hours. At a critical moment, Geronimo and 4 other Apache warriors found themselves surrounded, out of arrows, out of bullets, with only knives and sheer fury left. A Mexican soldier wielding a sword lunged at Geronimo. The 2 men collided, tumbling to the ground in a desperate struggle for survival. As they wrestled in the dirt, a sudden flash of memory struck him. 1858 Apache village. The air was thick with smoke. His heart pounded as he sprinted through the burning lodges. Scattered across the ground were bodies, his people, his family. His wife, Alapi, and their 3 children lay lifeless, their blood soaking into the sand. The screams of the dying still echoed in his ears. Mexican soldiers had done this. They had taken everything. That is the reason why Geronimo fought with unrelenting ferocity, and after a brutal struggle, he gained the upper hand, driving his blade into the soldier's chest. Exhausted, Geronimo collapsed to the ground, his breath ragged from the battle. As he lay there, he realized his body was covered in blood, his own, his enemies, a mixture of both. When he finally stood, he grabbed the fallen soldier's sword. Scanning the battlefield, he saw the bodies of Mexican troops scattered across the landscape. The remaining Apache warriors stared at him, silent for a moment, before erupting into victorious war cries. In 1858, Geronimo returned from a hunting trip to find his village in ashes, his wife, children, and people slaughtered by Mexican soldiers. Grief turned to fury, and under the cold moon, he swore vengeance. Legend has it that during this battle, he was called Geronimo as Mexican troops cried out to Saint Jerome for salvation. Though the name's true origin remains debated, it became forever tied to his legacy. Geronimo did not stop. Between 1859 and 1861, he led numerous attacks deep into Mexico, becoming a nightmare for its people. But not everyone stood with him. Many Apache warriors criticized his relentless bloodlust, arguing that his vengeance cost too many Apache lives. But Geronimo did not care. He was consumed by hatred, and war was the only path he knew. By the 1870s, the Apache-Mexico conflict had waned, but Geronimo's hatred never faded. Captured by the Americans, he spent his final years in Oklahoma, defiant even in old age. In his memoirs, he wrote, "I have killed many Mexicans. I do not know how many. Some were not worth counting. It was long ago, but I still have no love for the Mexicans. If I were young, that path would lead me into Mexico." Yet, as he lay in that cold cabin, a thought haunted him. What had it all been for? He had avenged. He had killed. But his people remained in chains. His homeland was lost. His family gone. For the first time, regret crept in. Was Geronimo a freedom fighter or just another pawn in an endless cycle of vengeance?